Hello and welcome to Unleashed. Unleashed is powered by Umbrex. You can find transcripts of every episode of Unleashed at umbrex.com/unleashed. Sign up for the email. I'm excited to be here today with John Horn. He's a McKinsey alum, and he is the author of Inside the Competitor's Mindset: How to Predict Their Next Move and Position Yourself for Success. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Will. I'm looking forward to it.
So, John, why should we care about what our competitors' mindset and what they're doing?
The number one reason to care about the competitors is because whenever you formulate a strategy or whenever you do something in the outside world, competitors are going to influence whether that succeeds or not. The competitors can lower their prices. It's the easiest strategic, I would say it's the easiest strategic lever for someone to pull is if you introduce a great new product, I'll just lower my price. You enter a new market to compete with me, I'll just lower my price. It's not that hard of a strategic response in order to try to prevent whatever your brilliant new strategic idea is, to dull it from being successful. And no competitors out there saying, "Oh, I want Will to be successful with that new idea." They're going to try because it's in their best interest to stop you from being successful. So we have to pay attention to our competitors. And it's better to pay attention to our competitors before we make a choice and before we make a move in the real world to think about how might they respond so that we don't get a really bad response, a really restrictive response, than to wait until after you respond and then say, "Oh, what do we do now?" So we need to pay attention to competitors, even in today's environment with platforms and ecosystems and partnerships and whatnot, because competitors are still out there trying to prevent you from having success because that's what competitors do. That's what you do with your competitors. And so there's no reason we shouldn't turn around and think about competitors doing the same with us. And I think it's also important to really focus on deliberately because what I've observed over 20 years of talking to clients and companies about this is that competitors are, because of the fact that we can't talk to them directly, they're sort of seen as a mystery and we don't understand them and we can't talk to them to ask them what they're going to do. And because of that, we either make guesses or we don't really pay attention to them that much. And when they do something that we don't like or do something that we wouldn't do, we chalk it up to it's because they're irrational. And they're not irrational. They're doing things which are best for them. It goes back to the first point. They're trying to be successful. And when you turn around and look at the world from their viewpoint and try to understand why would they do this in terms of success for them, it makes a lot of sense why they do what they do in terms of making being successful for them. So it's important because you're even a monopolist has companies that are trying to chip away its market share or constrict what it can and cannot do. We all have competitors and we have to pay attention to them.
So, let's say that we have a limited amount of attention, and in a very simple model of the world, we might say, okay, any external attention, we're going to split it between customers and competitors. So we could
Uh-huh.
do 90% competitors and 10% will focus on customers, or 90% customers, 10%, or 50-50. I
Hmm.
would I would assert, and I'm curious to hear your reaction, that different types of markets, we should think about having a different split of that attention. So, in a very established market, it's been around for a while, I don't know, toilet paper, let's say, you might want to have a
Hmm.
lot of focus on your competitors, because their moves are, maybe established players, established markets, established channels, established pricing, established product types. You might really want to focus on your competitors. Whereas a much newer market, wide open, wild west kind of field, like the new world of AI, all these new companies that are sprouting every single day, you might in those cases might want to have a filter that's much more on customers, because it's almost sort of a blue ocean, right? Like the open space is much bigger than any other competitors out there. So do you agree or
Yeah.
disagree?
I agree completely with the concept that every company should be focusing on their competitive insight in a slightly different angle based on their context and their situation. What I would what I would modify a little bit is to say it's not an either customers or competitors. If we take the example of toilet paper, I want to understand the big major players out there, and I want to probably understand them based on pricing and potentially product innovation. What are you going to innovate that's going to make toilet paper more attractive to buy from you than from me? Probably not a lot of market entry challenges, probably not a lot of entrepreneurial startups. So I don't have to worry about that. But if you look at AI and you say, well, I'm just going to focus on customers and what customers want, I'm focusing on what customers want. Customers may not know what they want because it's such a new industry, it's a new innovation, it's a new sector. And so I talk to some customers and tell them a lot of times, here's what I can do. Do you like that or not? And then I ask them, what do you want? And they said, well, we don't really know because we're not sure what AI can do. So, well, here's what we can do with AI. Oh, yeah, that sounds good. If I'm not paying attention to my competitors and what they're offering, I'm not understanding who is offering it, what they're doing, then I'm going to be really in a challenging position because I don't know how competitors are talking to customers and what competitors are offering, and therefore if customers like that better. So I should always be paying attention to my competitors. I think the where I would say the challenge comes organizationally is that I would not have the same group focus on both customers and competitors and then just go back and forth of what share of the time they focus on either. I would think about one group that like through the marketing department that focuses on customers, and then in the strategy group or another area. If it is in the marketing department, I talk about this in the book. Just make sure it's separated from the like the brand development and the customer segmentation focus groups, and that group should focus on the competitors. And then you need to have the interactions and the discussions inside to sort of compare the notes from the two sides. It's I talk about the book. It's about adopting a different viewpoint, the competitor's viewpoint, to position yourself for success. Well, it's helpful to have the viewpoints from the people who are looking at a competitor saying, yeah, here's what OpenAI is doing. Here's what Google's doing. Here's what Microsoft is doing. Here's, what all these companies are doing on AI. And then the customer group says, yeah, but from what we talk to customers, they don't care about any of that. I'd come back and say, well, then why are they all doing that? What do they know that we don't know? And that's where that healthy debate of what is best for us as an organization could arise in that new sort of innovative. I love the blue ocean analogy and I love that concept, but I talk about this a little bit in the book. I touch on it, which the question of why is the ocean blue? Is the ocean blue because my competitors have already gone into that part of the ocean and realized there's no food and so they left? Is it because the competitors haven't looked in that part, but once I swim out there and start eating, they're going to follow en masse? Is it because it really is something that they're not capable of doing because it's too deep, it's off the reef, and therefore they're reef fish and I'm a deep ocean fish and I can live out there? Without understanding why the competitors aren't in that blue ocean, it doesn't really tell me if it's a viable ocean for me to swim in. And that's where I think that last sort of gap is in terms of how we think about what our strategy creation is.
Okay, so let's talk about how to do it. In your book, you say that there are 4 steps to understanding the competition. Number 1, review public communication and actions. Number 2, assess competitor assets and resources. Number 3, consider the human factor. And number 4, predict, observe, and adjust. Okay, so put some flesh on that. For listeners that haven't read your book yet, walk us through how do you actually gather intelligence on your competitors so you can build a picture of their mindset?
Yeah, so that 4-part framework is work I developed with 2 other colleagues at McKinsey. It's the framing for how to understand why the competitor does what they do, how to get inside their mindset. Most companies do the first step, just pay attention to what they say and do, analyst reports, annual reports, earnings calls, reverse engineering, mystery shopping, et cetera. Most companies, if they do competitive intelligence, that's what they do. The next 3 steps are where I see in the book, I call this competitive insight. So it's not just information that I gather. The second step of what assets and resources and capabilities they have is where you start to think about how competitors are different from you. If we step back, the number one lesson everyone's taught as a strategy leader or as a business leader is find something different, find a way to differentiate yourself, different customer segment, different geography, different product, different whatever, so that customers are focused on you and not and because of your differentiation. Well, if that's true, then all of your competitors are also trying to focus on their differentiation, which means they have different things they can build on, different geographies, different supply chains, different whatever, different product portfolios. So that's number two. Just don't think of them as you, think of them as them. If you were running their company, what would you do? The third step is who's the person making the decision? And this is, this isn't a black box making a choice as a competitor, just like your organization isn't a black box making a choice. It's leaders who have backgrounds and histories and patterns. And if you think, the analogy I use is if a CEO grew up as a marketer, that was their career path. They're not going to be hired as CEO and suddenly say, now I want to optimize factory floor plans. They're going to look at the world from a marketing point of view. If you have someone who, I had a client once in basic materials sector, and the customer hired someone as a buyer who used to work in CPG retail. And they said, we're pretty sure this means they're going to act differently than we're used to, but we just want help making sure we're thinking about this right. That's really the principle, is think about the person making the decision. How long have they been in the industry? What the functional areas they've had? Sort of what's their mindset of how they view the world and how they view the problem? Because that's based on their history. And then the fourth thing, which is really important, is make the prediction and then follow it up. The prediction should be shorter term, no more than a year, because as human beings, we can't predict out 5 years anyway. That's just, we're not capable of it. We're not no better than chance. But make shorter term predictions and then go back and see how well you did on the prediction. And if you didn't get it right, look back to say, what'd you miss? Oh, I forgot that they just acquired this small company, or oh, they just hired a new executive, or that's right, they've been talking about this, but it was in this industry publication that we weren't paying attention to, whatever. Now I know what to pay attention to of the, what do they say and do, what assets and resources do they have, and who's making the decision, and make a new prediction and see how you did keep getting better by focusing on the right things. That's sort of the core of how to have the right mindset. And then how to actually operationalize this, that's about how you integrate it in the organization. And the number one lesson there is make it fit the organization. If you're centralized, don't have a decentralized competitive insight function. If you are brand focused, don't have it based on regions. However you focus your firm, however you structure your firm in the matrix sense, that's how you should matricize your competitive insight function. And once it fits within you thought about that, the second lesson to operationalize it is think like an entrepreneur. Start small. It sort of goes back to the question we were talking about, is how do we think about customers versus competitors? We'll pay attention to the competitors and the decisions that are most surprising or most challenging for you to understand. So start small. Like an entrepreneur, start with a minimum viable product and have that MVP, and then go out to the people in the organization and say, here's what we know about competitor X in terms of pricing. And they're like, great, that's really helpful. Now can you tell us about product portfolio? Sure. And now I add that into my competitive insight. That's great. Can you help us understand competitor Y? Sure. And you just keep building over time as you enhance that MVP. No different than the advice you would give to an entrepreneur about start small, start focused, get feedback from customers, and iterate to build over time to something that's big and grand and super useful.
Okay, so let's say that we're advising a growing company that previously has not had a competitive intelligence function, and they want to build one. So let's go really through just the bare bones, table stakes, basics of this in terms of, in your last answer, you kind of did a little bit of a sort of and so on, but let's really get into the specifics of just even on that step one, what source of information typically should they be tracking and how to do it? So is there some software packages that firms often use? There's a whole range of different document types, right? There's SEC filings, there's talks, there's going on LinkedIn and seeing how many employees they have and where, there's their website, there's their social media. So how do you recommend gathering all this information together? What should you be gathering? Like what's the org structure look like? To talk us about how to run one of these functions.
So as far as let me start with the what kind of information to gather and where. There are companies which have been developing competitive intelligence, competitive insight dashboards. And they are, for the most part, they're pretty good at going out and scraping publicly available third-party data on market shares and prices and retail outlets and information, the 10K information from the SEC and all the kind of stuff you talked about, the basic facts and figures, the basic of that step one of what they say and do. And, there are a lot of different, I'm not going to, hear the best or the worst or whatever. It's, most of the dashboards are pretty good at doing that and just collecting that data.
Are there any that are like commonly known that you're not necessarily saying which is best, but you want to just rattle off some names of some well-known ones?
The two big names I've heard of and sort of poked around a little bit are Crayon and Clue, Klue. Crayon, both of them started, as my understanding is, as a market research function, and they've expanded into a competitive intelligence type of dashboard function.
Okay.
Because in a lot of ways, that is what market research is. It's collecting information on what competitors are doing in the space and how you compare to the competitors. What's different about competitive intelligence is a lot of those dashboards say we're better than them on market share, we're better than them on price, and we're better than them on net promoter score, et cetera. Competitive insight is they're better than us on. And it's just, again, that different mindset of how you think about analyzing the same data. So, again, if you search for, competitive intelligence dashboards, business analytics dashboards, Crayon, Clue, others would come up. It's sort of that, first couple of pages of Google Google search would find you some names. That's sort of step one. And where AI and technology, digital tools are really helpful is for gathering that mass amount of data from the outside. What's most valuable though, and this is where I don't think those dashboards have necessarily done a good job yet. What's most useful is the information that's inside the organization. A lot of times what I would do with clients and to help them understand how competitors are going to react is to run war games. War game is just a business simulation where we set up who are the players, what choices are we going to play over, pricing, product, market entry, whatever, the time frame we're going to simulate these choices over, and then I assign within the client organization who plays the client, who plays each of the different competitors we want in the game. So it's all within the organization. We don't ask other people from the outside in. And then we simulate, say, okay, go off I want you to think about the next 6 months and tell me what your pricing strategy, your product portfolio strategy is going to be, et cetera. And then we'd simulate that. Where I got most of the information to tell competitor teams how to think about playing their role was by asking people inside the client organization, tell me what you know about competitor X. And are they aggressive or not aggressive? What kind of products do they have? Which other products are good? Do they focus more on market share, profit, et cetera? Most of the information that I got for the role play cards came from inside the organization. And I strongly believe that every organization has so much more competitive insight within it. They just don't know how to collect it because there's no formalized structure. There's no way to actually extract that information. And that's where, again, I go back to this entrepreneurial analogy. Take like the CRM system. Every time a sales agent goes on a call, they've got to fill out a form that sort of, here's what we talked about, and here's the, so that we just keep track of that. Well, it wouldn't be that hard to add into your Salesforce or whatever your customer tracking system is, just one question, which is, which competitors did you talk about today? And that's it. You can even make it multiple choice, which is like the top 4 competitors and a 5th one other. And I heard from someone on I think it was another podcast I had done where they said they heard that some company actually on that type of system, they have, competitor X, competitor Y, competitor Z, and then a box which said, I didn't talk about any competitors, which sort of primes in the behavioral way of primes the sales agent to say, you probably should have been talking and asking about competitors. I think that was it. It's like, I didn't ask about any competitors. So it sort of primes you to say, you should be asking about what have you heard from about competitors. And then that can be built up over time. So now that it's only one question, it's literally 5 more seconds of filling out that form. So if you have a brand new form of saying, I want all this competitive insight into what you know about the competitors. It's another form I got to fill out. I'm going to ignore it and hopefully it goes away. if you had one question to the CRM form, which just says, who'd you talk about? And then once they get habituated to that, then you could start to see what are the patterns of which competitors, in which geographies, with which customer types, et cetera. And then add another question. What did you talk about? Pricing, product portfolio, it's partnerships, whatever. And then you can add another question as it gets more habituated with the sales force. You could do the same thing with R&D people when they have an after action report coming back from a conference. You can have the same thing from procurement when they talk to people in the supply chain. Start small, start adding more information, and then it becomes oh, we just give more information. And it's okay if you don't have everything from the sales force about that competitor, because now if I need to understand, say, on Nike and I need to understand Under Armour, I can now go back through my CRM system and say which sales agents have reported the most often they hear about Under Armour. Now I know who to go talk to and say, hey, you keep saying Under Armour comes up in your conversations with customers. What do you talk about? What are you hearing? What are they saying? It makes it so much easier to go and actually collect the information that's already in the heads of your staff. So that's sort of how you collect the data. And then where you put it, there's no right place. The only rule I say is don't make it part of marketing or finance unless the CMO or the CFO is very strategically focused and is deliberate about making sure it will get its strategic focus and not just one more tool to help with advertising, one more tool to help us, fill out the 10Ks at the end of the quarter, or at the end of the year, and the 10Qs at the end of the quarter. If that CFO or the CMO says, yes, this is going to be a very important sort of separate part of what we do to understand competitors, great. But if it's just we got to tack this on because, that's also part of my role is to do strategy, it's generally not going to be given the focus that it needs.
Now, a project type that we support relatively often here at Umbrex is clients asking us to do some kind of voice of the customer insights, where we may, depending on the scenario, we'll interview customers in that industry. In some cases, it'll be a warm intro to their own customers. Some cases, it's a warm intro to customers that left them for a competitor, or that joined them from a competitor, or that considered them but ultimately didn't select them and selected someone else. In some cases, we will go out and source those competitors by reaching out to people in the industry. Talk a little bit about your perspective on the value of those kind of conversations with customers who are the ones making the decision, and this is particularly around B2B type customers.
Yeah, I think anytime you can solicit information from customers, or if you think at the other end of the supply chain from suppliers, like how easy is it to work with us relative to our competitors? How easy is it, what types of products and services are they, or obviously there are always NDA issues both with customers and suppliers, but to the extent that your legal team signs off on the questions you want to ask, going out and asking up and down the supply chain is a great way of collecting information. The one challenge I see with it in terms of how it's implemented is a lot of times I see those questions asked in terms of voice of the customer, in terms of what's good about us. What's good about us relative to the competitor? Where do we have strengths relative to the competitor? Why do you like buying from us relative to the competitor? Why didn't you buy from the competitor relative to us? It's always the what's so great and fantastical about us. Tell us things that are going to make us feel good about us. If you flip those questions around and you say, why would you switch to the competitor instead of us? Why have you preferred, or what makes you interested about the competitor's product relative to us? What is so great about the competitor in terms of their products? If you had to pick 3 attributes of the products or services they offer, which would you be that say they're world class on? It's a deliberate focus on not just how good we are. That's going back to why I'm not always a fan of putting it in marketing, is because as a marketer, you're trained to find things that are great about your product or service and to sell the consumer on the things that are great about you. It's an internally focused exercise. Whereas competitors is really an externally focused exercise. I've got to understand them as a one sort of example is it wasn't really about trying to understand competitors. It was a strategy development workshop I ran with a company. It was a B2B company, so similar to what you were sort of talking about, this was not a customer consumer focused exercise. And as part of the exercise, near the end of the workshop, I asked the participants, and these were all like vice president to senior directors and above. And I asked them, I said, okay, I want you to take 10 minutes and just come up with a list of what are all the qualities that make you distinctive as an organization and that would make customers, like, what are your sales messages to customers that really make you stand out? And I said, you can talk amongst yourselves and work in little groups, et cetera. So they worked, and at the end I said, okay, what'd you come up with? And they said, we have the best quality, and we have great service, and we have great reliability, and we're attentive to customers, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a great list. It sounded good, but it sounded so, I don't want to say bland, but it sounded just so like anyone should be saying this. And I was thinking that as they were saying all these things, but before I had the chance to sort of push back and say, this sort of sounds like anyone would be saying this, the CEO of the division raised their hand and said, can I say something? And I was like, oh, he's going to say, this is great. This is fantastic. We should go execute. He's like, I'm sure every single one of our competitors is making that exact same list and saying that's why they're great. So if that's why they're great, why are we great? And that's that difference of the client was looking internally of what they want the customer to believe. And so if you go and actually ask the voice of the customer, but explicitly focus on what makes the competitor better, why do you like the competitor better? I think it's great. If instead your questions are what makes us great, then you're going to, again, you ask someone a question, they're going to answer the question you ask. What makes you great? You got really good service. What makes the competitor great? They got better service.
Yeah.
If you don't ask that question, that you're not likely to get that last piece of information. And that's about priming the interviewee to say, no, I want you to focus on the competitor. What can you tell us about the competitor along those dimensions?
Talk to us. You mentioned it, you kind of alluded to it. Tell us a bit about how to put competitive intelligence, where to put it in the organization so that it's going to have sufficient stroke to get attention from the senior level team, and like how should it be incorporated into company decision making? So how often should it be reporting to people? Who should check with competitive intelligence? How do you get product people to be incorporating their insight? How do you give them sufficient kind of power and authority, or at least not, if not authority, at least sort of prestige that their opinions matter?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, there's no sort of, take it off the shelf, follow this checklist and you're done. The biggest challenge with competitive insight functions is that they're cost centers. They don't really drive revenue directly. And so whenever there's a challenge inside the organization, it's on the chopping block of that's how we save costs, unfortunately. How you make, if you have senior leadership support, C-suite, division heads, et cetera, if you have senior leadership support, that's the best way to protect and drive we have to use this inside of our organization to make strategic decisions. There sort of two things to do that. Number one is that it goes back to what I said before, is start small. Don't try to do everything for everyone. It's an impossible task. It's it's boiling the blue and the red oceans at the same time. You just can't understand every competitor on every decision all at once and have that information accessible. So again, go around and interview people inside the organization. Which are the competitors that most surprise us? Which are the competitors we think are irrational? Which are the competitors that we really want to understand best? And then based on that, narrow the list down to one, maybe two to start with. And then you can go back and say, okay, you talked about, this competitor you want to understand. What types of decisions? Is it pricing? Is it market entry? Is it product portfolio? Is it M&A? Is it supply chain? Is it talent development? In the book, I did a survey of 500 plus directors and above and asked them about how often competitors act irrationally along 13 different types of strategic choices. That I would say, borrow those 13 and say, which of these types of strategic choices matter? And again, focus on one or two. So you're starting small and focused, which means you don't need a really large team and you don't need a really big ask from the IT group to integrate that into the existing dashboards and reporting systems, et cetera. So start small, earn the right to expand. It also means that it's easier to figure out who needs this information. So if it's pricing information, I got to get to the sales team. Don't necessarily need the R&D and the supply chain, other folks to need it. If they want it, they can have it. But really, it's about the sales force need that pricing data. If it's about product design, product portfolio, then I do want the R&D folks to really understand that, because that's sort of what their job is focused on. So that's how I collect the information, and what extracting and then sharing it is. Again, start small. It doesn't mean it's not important, but if you have some big wins with the competitive insight group, then I don't like you. A lot of people understand the analogy where I'm going, but if you start small and they give you a taste and you like it, you want to come back for more. And that's really what you want to drive, is make it an organic growth inside the organization, as opposed to, we have this big function, you got to go use it. As far as how you get senior leadership support, if you're lucky enough to have senior leaders that believe in this, then great. You're sort of already halfway there. If you don't, the best way to convince senior leaders that they need to focus on this is by anecdote and not by data. And I know that anecdote is not proof. I know that we're always taught with big data to have regression analysis and lots of data to validate what the idea is. But you want anecdotes. And this is where you can now go around and ask and survey people. I would say maybe you could probably do director level above, or even maybe general manager level and above, and ask them, hey, can you remember a time where we made a choice in the market, introduced a new product, entered a new market, changed our pricing structure, whatever it was, and it was just a disaster. It just didn't work out right, and primarily because a competitor did something that sort of halted what we were hoping to achieve. And I'm not going to bet my life, but I'm pretty sure that every single organization has those stories inside its walls of, oh my gosh, remember that time we tried to enter Latin America and the local company just dropped their price and prevented us from getting share? How much did that cost us? It was a $250 million investment, and it just never really panned out. Those stories, you can then go back and say, okay, what did we know at the time we made our choice? What did we know about the competitor in Latin America? What could we have figured out? Well, we could have figured out they'd done this 5 times before. We could have figured out that they were, a long time. They had made statements about no one's going to invade our turf, whatever it is. Could we have shown that there was likely enough information? We could have put together a picture that said they're likely to respond aggressively. That's the story you go take. Hey, remember the time we tried to enter Latin America and we blew that $250 million investment because the local player attacked us back and we just didn't have a response? Yeah, well, at the time, we could have known that they made these 5 statements and they'd already done this 3 times before with other multinationals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we had a CI function, we could have seen that coming, most likely, and we could have probably prevented it from being as bad as it was. We need to start doing this. Stories are more important than how often does this happen, right? And to give me a regression analysis of the impact of blah, blah. It's like getting the mindset of the executive of, do you want to be the one making the decision of a $250 million investment and it goes bad? Because a senior executive looking at that says, I don't want to be the one on who's ever looking at saying, why'd you make that decision? If I could invest a little bit in a CI function and try to prevent that from happening, that's how you can try to convince senior leaders that this is something we need to do. And again, once you convince them, and you start showing it's valuable, they're fine to keep investing in it, because everyone comes back and says, no, we need this, we use this. The last thing I would say is there's one company I talked to, and their competitive insight function had such good senior leadership support that whenever anyone went to the CEO to make a strategic presentation, the first question before they even started was, did you talk to the competitive insight group? And if the answer was no, the person had to leave the room. They couldn't make their presentation. So again, if you get that strong of senior leadership support, you're like golden.
Good to your homework.
Doesn't have to be to that level. Yeah, it just has to be to, get them to understand that this is a valuable part of the organization. And again, anecdotes, in my opinion, are better than trying to have some it's had a 0.02%, impact on the earnings per share over time, blah, blah, blah. Don't try to do that. Just tell horror stories that make the executives think, I don't want to be the one in that story. I don't want people telling that story about me in 10 years.
So listeners, once again, title is Inside the Competitor's Mindset. We'll include a link in the show notes. John, beyond a link to your book, where else? What other links would you like to provide for listeners to find out what you're working on?
I have a link on the Washington University Olin Business School website, but I also have my own firm, and I share information there. The URL is gatewayinsights.com, uh, GATEWAY insights plural.com. Um, it's I talk about how I can help with war games and competitive insight functions and the types of stuff we talked about today. It's also just, if someone wants to reach out and say, hey, I'd love to talk about this more, you can contact me through that. Or you can contact me through the email at OWASU, either one.
Fantastic. We'll include those links. John, it was great having you on the show today. Thanks for raising our awareness level of competitive intelligence and how important it is to track what your competitors are doing. It's great having you on the show.
Well, thanks for asking me, Will. I really enjoyed the conversation.